متحرك عن مواضيعه. ولما نقول فك الجدار يعني ترقيم الحجارة وإعادة وتعويض الحجارة المتأثرة، وبعدين نعيد الحجارة الأصلية إلى مواضعها. فك الجدار من الجهة الجنوبية الغربية حتى مستوى المدمك 8 لتعويض الحجارة المنكسرة عند المدمك 5. فك جزئي للجدار الداخلي من الجهة الشمالية الغربية ومعالجة التصدعات سي يعني المرقمة سي اللي شفتوها في معالجة تجمع المياه وركودها داخل الغرف لما تشكله من تهديد لجدران الغرف والجدران السميكة للبرج. معالجة الفراغات بين القوالب الحجرية على مستوى الواجهات وعلى كامل المحيط البالغ 24 متر. معالجة محيط البرج عند الواجهة الجنوبية المهددة بارتفاع منسوب المياه الوادي أثناء الأمطار الغزيرة. هذا المنظر العام لبرج الختم بعد التدخلات يعني النهائية. فالاستقرار السفلي واضح وتتركز وكانت المشاكل تتركز في الأجزاء العلوية ونقاط الالتقاء العناصر المعمارية. هذا يعني إشارة صغيرة إلى محيط المعلم واللاندسكيب. تظهر الصورة محيط البرج وتأثر المشهد الطبيعي الذي كان قديما مفتوحا ودون بنايات حديثة في محيط المعلم. القراءة المقارنة نفس نكاد نتبين أن العمارة هي نفس العمارة لكن سلوك بنيوي مختلف بسبب التأسيس ومنطق البناء. تتيح المقارنة المعمارية والإنشائية بين برج الرجوم وبرج الخشم لتنوع الحلول البنائية التي اعتمدتها مجتمعات الألفية الثالثة قبل الميلاد في موقع بيت. وتبرز بوضوح أن العمارة البرونزية في هذا الموقع لا تخضع لنموذج واحد ثابت، بل تمثل طيفا واسعا من الخيارات التقنية والتنظيمية التي استجابت لشروط توبوغرافية ووظيفية وزمنية متباينة رغم التقارب المكاني بين المعلمين، ونقصد برج الرجوم وبرج الختم طبعا. فالمقارنة إذا أخذنا الجانب التوبوغرافي، الرجوم أرضية غير صخرية، قاعدة حجرية واسعة لتوزيع الأحمال. الختم نتوء صخري مدمج في بنية استقرار أعلى. مسار الجدار الدائري، الرجوم جدار غير مسترسل يتبع مبدأ الارتفاق نظام الارتداد الإنشائي. الختم جدار دائري مسترسل. التنظيم المعماري، الرجوم تنظيم بسيط مغلق حول فناء وبئر. الختم تنظيم معقد ببرجه ومرفقاته ضمن مجمع متعدد الوظائف. تقنيات البناء، الرجوم تفاوت كبير بين قوالب وقاعدة شعاعية لضبط الاستقرار. الختم انتظام أوضح في الرصف بفضل الدعامة الصخرية. مقاربة الترميم، الرجوم تثبيت القاعدة والتحفظ على إعادة القوالب. الختم الحفاظ على علاقة العمارة بالصخر وقراءة المجمع. مبادئ التدخل، أكيد نحن حتى نحافظ على القيمة على أصالة المعلم لابد أن نكون على غاية كبيرة من الحذر في التدخل. فنحن نعتمد كما هو متداول ومعروف مبدأ التدخل بالحد الأدنى، ولكن الحد الأدنى في بعض الأحيان في وضعيات أنك تتجاوزك وما تقدر إلا مثلا في بعض الأحيان أنت إذا عندك قالب حجري متصدع في مدمك رقم 5 وأنت عدد المدامك 8، فأنت مضطر أنك تفك 3 مدامك من الفوق حتى توصل لكن ومع ذلك نحاول إلى قدر المستطاع أنه فكان المدامك العلوية يكون مرقمة حتى نعيد نفس القالب الحجري إلى مكانه، إلا إذا كانت الحجارة متأثرة وغير قابلة لأن نعيد إلى مكانه. يخصص هذا المحور لعرض أعمال الترميم والصون بوصفها مسارا تطبيقيا قائما على تشخيص علمي موثق، حيث لا ينظر إلى الترميم كمرحلة لاحقة لأعمال التنقيب. وهذه الحقيقة نحن من محاسن الصدف أنه الأمثلة مثال برج الرجوم وبرج الختم يعطي فكرة على ما معنى أن تتلازم أعمال الترميم مع أعمال التنقيب، وما معنى أن تنفصل هذه عن ذاك. فهذا يعني بون شاسع بين المنهجين، وحتى حتى المعرفة. فأنا أتذكر مع الدكتور كتاني كنا نفتح مجال للنقاش في عديد المجالات في عديد المواضع حتى نفهم إلى أي مدى بأي طريقة. ونحن ما قدرنا نبدأ أي حركة إلا ما كان الدكتور كتاني موجود، وسألناه في عديد المواضع في الأسبار اللي تم إنجازها في كذا، هل هذا ممكن نغمره، هذا ممكن نتركه، إلى أي مدى هذا الجانب يعني تم الانتهاء من النتائج الأثرية، هل ممكن فيه فرص يقول أنه هذا الجانب لازم نخليه ظاهر، هذا الجانب لأنه أغمره لا حاجة من بقائه. فهل النقاش بين الأثري والمعماري جدا مجدي. فهذه أهمية الفريق المتعدد الاختصاصات. الفريق المتعدد هو حماية للمعلم وحماية لأصالته ولقيمته التاريخية، هذا مؤكد. إلى الترميم كمرحلة لاحقة لأعمال الترميم، بل كامتداد مباشر للفهم الأثري والمعماري والإنشائي للمعلم. وينطلق هذا المسار من أداة تشخيص دقيقة، ويتدرج عبر توصيف المعطيات وقراءة التركيبة وصولا إلى الفعل الميداني وفق تسلسل منهجي يضبط حدود التدخل ويضمن احترام منطق البناء الأصلي وأصالة المعلم. هذه مظاهر من الأعمال اللي تم إنجازها، وحركة يعني المختصين اللي كانوا موجودين على عين المكان. يعني في بعض الأحيان كنا مضطرين، لأنه أعمال التنقيب في بعض الأحيان لم تقدم الإجابة، فكنا بالتشاور مع الفريق المنقب نقيم بأعمال تنظيف حتى تظهر الهياكل الأثرية وتظهر مساراتها وتظهر كذا. ففي أعمال تنظيف أثري، احنا نسميها أعمال تنظيف أثري، نستكملها حتى تظهر عديد التفاصيل وتظهر مساراتها، حتى لا يتم لأنه الخطأ فاجعة. الخطأ أنك تنطلق في بناء جدار غير موجود، وهذه إشكالية كبيرة. كذلك أنا أغتنم الفرصة حتى صراحة أوجه كل عبارات الشكر إلى الفريق اللي كانوا يشتغلوا معنا، فريق دائرة بات، الأخ محمد الكلباني، الأخ محمد الغابي لو أحد أعضاء الفريق، الأخ سليمان. كانت فيه الفريق كنا فريق متماسك أيضا، وكان كل الدعم نلقاه من الدائرة اللي كانت تقدم، وكانت فيه مشاركة. الأخ بدر أصبح الآن مستقل بذاته وقادر حتى يتابع أعمال. فهذه المهم، نحن كانت حلقة التكوين اللي كان يأكد عليها الأخ سلطان، قدرنا نأمنها. مثلا ممكن الأخ كلباني يأكد كلامي مع الأخ بدر اللي أصبح الآن قادر أنه يتابع ويراجع. وهذه أهمية العمل، أنك تقدر تسلم المشعل لغيرك حتى يقدر يواصل المسيرة. مظاهر أيضا، نحن كنا نوثق أيضا كل حجارة نرفعها من مكانها، نحدد مقاسها، نكتب. ما كانت عملية رفع القوالب اللي هي ثقيلة ما كان سهل. هذه مظاهر الوضعية اللي كنا. المهم كان ضروري أنه نرفع صقالات بارتفاع، إذا المعلم مرتفع على مدى 5 متر من مستوى الأرض. بالنسبة لبرج الرجوم ما في مشكلة، يعني ارتفاع الجدار 2 متر ونص. برج الختم كنا مضطرين أنه نرفع صقالات، وكانت ضروري تكون في دراسة للصقالات حتى نأمن على الناس اللي يشتغلوا بعدين. الرافعة اليدوية، لأنه نحن ما نستعمل معدات ميكانيكية ولا شيء، برافعة يدوية بطريقة. التدخلات في برج الختم تدخلات مرتبطة بالعناصر الداخلية وبالمجمع المحيط ونقاط الالتقاء. الصور أعرضها حتى يطلع المتابعين على جسامة الأعمال اللي تهيأ لأنه نصل لأعلى نقطة في المصطبة وكذا. وهذا أنا أشيد بجهود الفني محمد الغابي في قدرته على رفع الصقلات وبلوغ نقاط، يعني في بعض الأحيان بطرق تقليدية، لكن ما كان سهل أن نوصل لهذا الجانب. هذه إعادة القوالب إلى مواقعها بعد فكها وترقيمها وإعادة وضعها في أماكنها. هذا حتى شوف نتبين الارتفاع نتاع الصقلات، يعني يكاد يكون 3 طوابق. هذه الخطوات الأولى من بداية المشروع في برج الغنوم. هذا الرافعة اليدوية، المقارنة بين التدخل، اختلاف التدخل نتيجة اختلاف السلوك البنيوي، المقارنة بين برج الرجوم وبرج الغنم، يرتبط اختلاف التدخل بين البرجين باختلاف سلوكهم البنيوي وطبيعة الدعامة السفلية، لكن لكل منهما. ففي برج الرجوم المشيد على تربة غير صخرية والمتضررة بقاعدة جدران مع فقدان عدد من القوالب الحجرية، فرضت الحالة الإنشائية اعتماد تدخل مرحلي ذي طابق إنقاذي. بدأ العمل بالواجهات الأكثر تضرراً، خاصة الواجهة الجنوبية الغربية التي عرفت انهيار كبير، مع إعادة توظيف القوالب الحجرية الأصلية المستخرجة من محيط البرج وتعويض المفقود منها، كما تم توضيحه في التفاصيل وفي التشخيص بقوالب من نفس الجنس الحجري ومن مواقع قريبة وفق نسق يرتبط بحالة المحافظة وبالنظام المعماري المع. أما برج الختم فاستنادا إلى نتوء الصخري مدمج في بنية وفر استقرارا أعلى، ما وجب التدخل نحو مقاربة أكثر تحفظا ترتكز على الصون الوقائي والحفاظ على العلاقة بين العمارة والصخر وضبط حدود الإضافة إلى حد الأدنى، مع اعتماد فواصل واضحة تميز بين الإجراء الأصلي والقوالب المضافة حفاظا على أصالة المعلم وقيمته التاريخية. لا نحن تخيرنا أن كلما أضفنا واحدة نحط شواهد تبين أنه القسم المضاف وأنه القسم اللي، وهذه شواهد خشبية يعني موجودة في معلم. الخاتمة يؤكد هذا البحث أن الترميم، هذا أن الترميم ليس إجراء تقنيا وفنيا فحسب، بل يمكن أن يكون أداة لفهم العمارة البرونزية موضوع الدراسة والتدخل من أجل المحافظة. فكل برج من الأبراج، برج الرجوم وبرج الخاتم، يمثل حالة إنشائية مستقلة تستدعي تدخلا يرتبط بنظام المعمارية ووضعية المحافظة، كما يعد التشخيص القائم على القالب الحجري المدخل الحقيقي لفهم السلوك البنيوي، ومن هذا الفهم المعماري والإنشائي الدقيق ينبثق القرار المحافظ بوصفه امتدادا طبيعيا له. ولكم جزيلا.
شكرا جزيلا. ما عندنا وقت للسؤال unfortunately. So we're going to go for the coffee break, no time for questions, and we see you again at 4 for the last session. Well, you can discuss about coffee break.
No, it's for the general, because it's very, very, very important to say that. First, I would thank you for the hard working, but being a UNESCO consultant, I would say that till the عفوا تحكي العربي أفضل الترجمة موجودة. لحد الاستمارة أنا ما كان عندي مشكلة بإنك تكون لدرجة البلوك القالب، على إنه مفهوم البناء أو الفابريك تبع البناء، يعني كلمة فك This is مش يعني هذا ما بنقدر نعمله إحنا، إني عشان أنا يونت واحدة أفكك الهيستوري كلياته. العمارة مادة، تقنية وفن. أنت ركزت على المادة ونسيت التقنية ونسيت الفن العمارة نفسه. بس نفك الجدار إحنا ونرد نبني، غيرنا الهيستوري تبعه كله.
عفوا لعلك لم تفهم.
فهمت أنا الجزئية اللي بررت فيها أنت بررت حكيت.
الفك ماهوش بمعنى إزالة الجزء. أنت أمام جزء متراكم منهار، فأنت تفك الحجارة نتاعه المتراكمة حتى تعيدها إلى مكانها. نحن لا نشتغل على أجزاء، فك أجزاء متماسكة موجودة. الواجهة الخلفية الجنوبية الغربية كانت وأنا لما أحكي على فك الركام اللي موجود وإعادة نحن حتى في تجميع الحجارة، حتى في تجميعها نجمعها في مكانها حتى نأمن أنه نعيد الحجارة الأصلية.
صحيح، هذا كويس. بس أنا في كلمة الفك
لعله الاستعمال للفك أثر شوي، وكان ممكن نلقى مفرد متقارب، بس أنا أفهم عليك. شكرا على ملاحظتك.
Sorry, you will continue the discussion after, because we have another session and we are late. But just, I will be the next chairman. I want that you will be on time for the next speaker. And remember, Khaled, that you're not correct, because you spoke too much. And just to inform all the people, it's exact that we discussed about the restoration of Al Kutum, but when the restoration started, we never were been contacted and discussed. So we have seen the result without any discussion together. Just to inform all the people here.
Dr. Katani, in French, can you speak in French?
Thank you very much. End of session, see you at 4.
So I'm taking a slightly different approach than other people who've presented so far that I've seen. When I was thinking about this paper, I took a look at the Journal of Oman Studies for the past 50 years and counted the number of articles and the number of articles that dealt with graves, tombs, cemeteries, anything to do with mortuary archaeology. This includes surveys, excavations, and sometimes just the mention of a tomb that helps us locate it or directs us to an area we need to investigate. And I found that approximately 15% of the articles published dealt with these topics, and they range from surveys, like I said, to detailed excavations. I say approximately 15% because there were many articles that I'm sure I didn't count, and I think the number is probably higher. The point is that since its inception, the Journal of Oman Studies has published quite a lot of information and reports on mortuary archaeology writ large. So whether that's mapping tombs, excavating them, or mentioning their existence. So overall, the themes that are important in this discipline, of course, are what? So what kind of structures are tombs? Which of the structures we see are tombs? What kind of tomb? What time period was it built and used? Where are these tombs located? How are they distributed on the landscape? What is their relationship to other tombs, to other buildings, to natural features? Why? Why are the tombs built in different styles? Why are they built to different locations? And finally, how? How are these tombs used to inter the dead? How is the body placed? How is the person honored with mortuary gifts? How was the tomb understood locally by foreigners and by people over time? So, limitations. Famously, we knew that mortuary contexts on the Arabian Peninsula were in a poor state. They didn't tell us much information. They're fragmentary, they're broken, they're not well preserved. This has been the line for many, many years. So I want to explore those limitations quickly here at the 50th celebration of the Journal of Oman Studies. Where are we with these limitations? So first, what? What structures are tombs? I think it's fair to say that we have a good understanding of the basic tomb types, but there's still assumptions being tested by recent excavations. Examples include the appearance of monuments, mortuary monuments, actually in the Neolithic period, when previously we assumed these started with the Hafid period cairns. Next, so it's as an example, some diversity in how these cairns may look. Next, where? I think we have an exceptional understanding of where tombs are placed, but we still have many assumptions about relationships between the tombs, the landscape, and other tombs. For example, very broadly across the region, the concept of territory marker is used for tombs, and I think that there's good evidence that that's not always the case. So just some pictures of Umanar tombs and Hafid cairns. I'm using the early Bronze Age as an example today, but I think we can make these generalizations about all of the eras in Oman history. And then, of course, a map that shows some of the larger regions of study that have happened over the years. Next, why? I think we have also a decent understanding of why different types of tombs are placed in different locations, but there are assumptions being made about variations and the reason for choices and variation in locations, for example. Another good example is Helban. So Helban has these small different color stones placed into the walls. Why? Different regions have different color stones placed into the walls, different types of stones, wadi cobbles, cut stones, etc. Why? Another excellent example, I think, is orientation of the entrances. It's sort of become a dogma that every Hafiq cairn opens to a particular location. And these are just the number of tombs and the different orientations of the entrances just at Jebel Hafit, for example. Hafiq cairns, we've discovered in the past, I'd say 15 years, that there's considerable complexity in internal architecture, as another example. And then, of course, Umanar tombs, which come in a wide variety of shapes and with quite a large variety of chamber numbers, and in some cases, 2 floors. So finally, how? I think we have an emerging or developing understanding of mortuary treatment, but assumptions remain about the agency of the tombs. And this is what I really want to focus on today, mortuary treatment. Again, in the beginning, I said we've assumed for a long time now that there's very little data that we can glean from these tombs. And I think that given these are just summaries, given the information that we've now gathered over this time, I think we're actually in a position now to be testing more complex, more sophisticated models of use of these tombs and the ideas they represent. Again, just some more examples of the chronology, the use, the reuse of these tombs. Sheffy Dopper wrote a great book on reuse of tombs, and in it she talks about the reuse related to memory, a collective memory. And I want to take that further and talk about not just memory, but what kind of ancestor. So many of you may have thought there was a typo in my title, a big A ancestor, little a ancestor, and family. And here I'm talking about the assumption that all of the people in the tombs are ancestors, that all of the tombs represent a home for the dead ancestors, and that the smaller numbers of people in the tombs may be families. We've all said this for a long time. Hafiq cairns hold families, but we actually don't know. This actually hasn't been tested. So here I challenge, who is an ancestor? And I think this is a good challenge for the Journal of Oman Studies for the next 50 years. Again, we're in a place now where we can talk about this. We can talk about a collective identity, a supernatural ancestor, somebody who goes into the ancestorhood as an unidentified person. They lose their individual identity versus your ancestor, your grandfather, your father, etc. And I think that dichotomy is clear in the Hafiq cairn, where you see these small number of interments high on the mountains, where individuals may be identified by their placement, compared with the communal tombs that we see in around 2700 BC, where suddenly you have everybody in the middle of almost a residential area. So from this dichotomy, from just this example, we have all of these evidences of ritual. And I'm going to skip through some of this quickly to get to my big points. What do these rituals mean? What does reuse mean? What does the use of fire mean? Why is the body broken? Why is the body moved into an invisible pit? Why are some tombs emptied before they're reused? Why are some people moved aside when the tomb is reused? Why are some people stacked when the tomb is reused? I argue that all of this is evidence of different ritual activity that people were engaging with, and that there's a large amount of diversity. So what does this mean? Is it disposal of the dead? Is it evidence of mourning rituals, emplacement on the landscape, incorporation into a spiritual world, ritual therapy, behaviors to reinforce group cohesion, or territorial signaling? And I think that any or all of these can be true in different regions, and that it's time for us to start testing this. So what's next? We have the old challenges of fragmentary remains, poor preservation, an inability to do chronometric dating because the collagen is not in the bones, an inability to do complex isotope analyses, again because of preservation, in particular the inability to do much with regard to understanding diet. other regions of the world, we can look at carbon and nitrogen isotopes, and we can talk about the type of food people were eating. This is a huge gap in what we understand about early Bronze Age people in northern Oman. The sample sizes we have for any information about diet are quite slim, and we need to be looking for new ways to test this. What does tomb reuse mean? And then how are we going to identify when tombs were looted, what's a looted tomb before we start excavating it, so that we make good decisions about our excavations. So I think that we have a lot of solutions available to us, or solutions that have already been enacted. So first, we need expert, not student excavation. And when I say that, I have changed actually a little bit on the slide. I don't mean no students. I mean either investing in more graduate students that are more highly trained and giving them the power to test interesting and innovative ideas, but not treating the bones like they will reveal nothing. We need adaptive excavation methods, which I think many of us are using now to get the bones out of the ground and reduce thermal shock. We need to trust the bioappetite dating, which has been demonstrated to be a good use for this region. We need to improve methods and conduct careful, controlled excavation. Tomb looting is still a problem, so that's still red. So here, more advanced graduate students. A really good example is Eugenio's team. Here he is. He has this graduate student, Victoria, who is looking at enamel and identifying the sex of the individuals in transitional or Hafit cairns, or cairns that were maybe used in the Umanar and then reused in the Iron Age. We're finally on the horizon of being able to tell who's inside the tomb by gender, and that's never been done before, aside from looking at the osteology, which is flawed. A couple of examples I want to go through really quickly, just to give you some examples of how we can use controlled excavation. You've probably all seen this. I've presented it and published it before. But here is an example of a cairn at Abu Sila near Dank, where we can see repeated use of the cairn. We have dates that situate the reuse of the cairns. So we have, and I know most of you know this, excavating this very carefully, we can understand the stratigraphy of the interments, date those interments, and then come up with a solid chronology for use. Another example from Al-Khubayb that again has been published and talked about many times is the use of discrete space within tombs. So at some point, we start seeing people use their private space inside of a tomb and not just using these as communal, these Hafit cairns. So we can start understanding, even a very small space, how this was used by different people at different times for different dead and meaning potentially different things. So what's next? We still have the fragmentary remains. We can handle that. We still have preservation issues. We can handle that. We still have tomb looting. Next, though, we need to test alternate models of interaction and process. We need targeted excavations of tombs in unusual locations and highly detailed analyses of the fragmented bone. And I'm going to show you why in a minute. And then finally, we need to consider using ancient DNA. And I will also show you an example of that in a minute. I'm not certain we're ready for human ancient DNA, but I'm happy to talk about that. Very quickly, I'm going to show you some results from the site of Dahwa, which we've heard a lot about today. You've all seen this before. This is a large 6-meter in diameter Umanar tomb. On your right is the Dahwa man, which Derek Kennett found in a survey. And so the excavation of this tomb is complete. It has 6 chambers and a corridor that allows communication between all the chambers, and it has a bone pit. And so I've been working very carefully. I excavated the tomb very carefully, and I've been painstakingly going through the human remains to understand the ritual behind the use of these different chambers and the bone pit. And unlike other scholars in the field who look at the bone pit in a much more utilitarian, having a much more utilitarian purpose as a place to put the waste from the tomb to clean it, I see the bone pit as part of the ritual itself, the final part of the ritual. One very interesting aspect of this that lets us get to the question of detailed analysis of human remains and ritual are the multiple plastering events in one section of the tomb only, here indicated by this arrow. Here we have evidence of primary interments. And just some images of the plaster. It's not pretty, it's not a beautiful floor, and it seems to potentially be something to seal in those layers. We also have right next to this, and I don't have a good picture here, a chamber that was closed. And so remember this, the plaster and a closed chamber at one section of the tomb. And here's the bone pit. Of course, we identified at least 2 areas of very high heat burning, and we're working on exploring that more. And we have an extensive stratigraphy that was identified for the bone pit, allowing us to identify how many, or approximate how many deposits were made. So I don't want to go through all of this, except to say that at the end of this excavation, you're left with the same kind of summary that everyone in every Umanard tomb comes up to. How many domestic vessels, how many international vessels, how many softstone vessels, what kind of metal, how many beads, how many people, all of that. And what I'm trying to do is to take this a step further and try to understand how this tomb can be used to elucidate the reasons why this process was taken up by these people seemingly suddenly. So all good science has questions that lead to more questions, and again, we don't need to go through these questions. You've seen me present this many times. But I want to show you some quick results of a very large collaboration that I'm doing that I think will give you some hope for the extensive potential of human remains and mortuary archaeology on the Arabian Peninsula. So this is a tooth, a loose tooth. So it's found not in a skull, not in a mandible, not in a maxilla, loose in the sediment in the tomb. Typically, most people will think this is not of much value, right? You don't know who it belonged to. You can't say male, female. You can say it's an adult. That's all you can say. But it has an extremely important deposit here, dental calculus. So this is the dental, the plaque in your mouth if you don't brush your teeth very well. That will eventually calcify and harden. Calcify. So I'm working with an excellent scholar, Gwen Robbins-Shug, at University of North Carolina, Greensboro, where she has a fancy lab, and she has been taking the calculus off of these teeth along with undergraduates and graduate students to explore what's in it. And we were hoping we might see something about diet. So remember what I said about the carbon and nitrogen isotopes. It's not really possible. What are people eating? Well, first, what are they doing? So here we see evidence of ceramic clay, mud brick, metals, including copper and tin, and fibers, including jute, silk, and cotton, on the tooth of this individual from Tahwa. We also are seeing evidence of wheat phytoliths, millet starch, okra, turmeric. So, very exciting. Now we have much more information from this one tooth about what people were doing and eating than we have from a whole lot of previous excavations of tombs. What else do we have? Well, another characteristic of early Bronze Age mortuary remains is that they're fragmented, very, very fragmented. It's very challenging osteology. You have to spend a lot of time looking at each fragment. We were able to identify something of an epidemic of leprosy at the site using the fragmented remains. And I'm going to go through this quickly and answer your questions later. But this is important because it's helping us understand interaction. This is the oldest leprosy in the world. Previously, leprosy was found in the modern country of India at, I think, about at least 500 or closer to 1,000 years more recent. And so we're working now with an ancient DNA lab to try to sequence the genome of this leprosy so that we can potentially understand the direction of the spread of leprosy. Does it come from the Indus people to the Arabian Peninsula? Does it come from Arabia to the Indus people? We're also getting a tremendous number of C14 dates. Okay, and then finally, go back to the tomb, go back to the architecture. Chamber C is closed, right? We remember this. Why? Also next to Chamber C are these multiple plaster events. Why? It turns out that most of the people with the leprosy are interred in this location. So it may be, although they're treated the same way as everyone else in that they're put in the same tomb, that they are closed off, that they are to prevent the spread of, they wouldn't understand it in terms of pathogen, but potentially in terms of ghost or haunting or spirit, potentially, that causes this severe illness. People here had visible leprosy, as in it affected the appearance of their nose. It would have eaten their nose away. You would see this person had this horrible disease. We're also looking at the bone pit. We're seeing also leprosy in the bone pit. So it's possible that it took a while for people to say, look, we've got to put these people, we've got to treat them a little differently in how we're interring them. We go back to our questions. So with these examples, I'm trying to demonstrate that the next 50 years of the Journal of Oman study has a lot of potential for us to look at these seemingly useless pieces of bone. So my final thoughts on this, and a challenge for the next 50 years, is for us to ask who's an ancestor. And when I ask who's an ancestor, I don't mean the supernatural big ancestor, collective ancestor. I'm talking about grandparents, parents, cousins, family on the landscape, versus who is the collective ancestor. Is there an anonymous ancestor for these early Bronze Age people? Do we have evidence of a mortuary ritual that is an ancestor cult? We use that phrase a lot. Do we have an ancestor cult? Do we have any evidence of that? Or do we have evidence of people commemorating individuals? Do we see change? Do we see variation at the different sites? All of these tools that I've gone through very quickly, we're now in a position where we can test these things here when we didn't think we could test them before. Finally, I want to ask who's family, and point out that we need to do a lot more with Hafid period cairns to determine what they're used for, and they may not be family cairns. And finally, I hope that we can start a conversation about kinship on the Arabian Peninsula, how people were identified, who was family. I have a graduate student now who's working on mobility isotopes, looking for Indus people at the Dahwa site, and we're not finding any. So were they part of a group that was accepted into the tomb when they died, or were they not? Are there different treatments for people who are foreigners, who migrated? Who is kin in this sense? Does it matter to be included in these tombs? We're in a position now where we can start asking these questions and really understand how people lived on the peninsula and interacted with people beyond trade. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we have time for one question.
You know, in India in old time, they used to consider leprosy as a person with different meaning. And they give it a positive meaning, like they were, like, I don't say they worshipped it, but they were using them as special people. They are not really victim of a disease. This can be taken into account also. Sometimes isolating them is not always a kind of victim of disease, but it could be also appreciation also.
Absolutely. And for brevity, I leaned toward the the problem interpretation, but you're absolutely correct. And it might explain how it is that so many people were walking around at Dahua with facial deformities. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you again. So, next speaker, Eugenio Bortolini. Chiudendo questo. So also Eugenio, I think he doesn't need to be presented. He belongs to the University of Bologna and he works in Oman since many years. He will present today a presentation about the funeral landscape at Wadi Al Fain in Oman. Please.
Thank you very much. And first of all, I would like to thank the Ministry of Heritage and Tourism, Sultan Qaboos University, and all the organizers for making it possible for me to be here today and to present you a short segment, a small segment of my PhD research, which was actually completed 13 years ago. And I haven't done much, unfortunately, on this data over the past 13 years, but I wanted to revive your interest in Wadi Al Fain and this region, so I thought this was the right occasion to do so. So, the project I'm referring to started in 2007 and 2008 for my BA dissertation under the supervision of Maurizio Cattani and the late Maurizio Tosi. And it went on for my PhD research between 2010 and 2013. The region I'm referring to is Wadi Al Fain, which is an alluvial corridor that develops north-south, and it's located right. Can you see my? Do we have a pointer? Doesn't work, and you can't see my. Okay, so it's located right here. Exactly in between the Agar al-Garbi on the west and Agar al-Sharqi on the east. Our study region begins roughly 8 kilometers to the south of the town of Iski, and it ends roughly to the south of the village of Shafa, to the northeast of Adam. The reason why we chose this region was that it was virtually unexplored for an archaeological point of view, with some exceptions, of course. First of all, Jürgen Schreiber's survey of the Iski and Jabal Akdar area, and of course the tombs of Zakit were already mentioned in the remarkable overview of tower tombs of southern and eastern Arabia by Paul Yule and Gerd Weiss-Gerber. Actually, the tombs of Zakit were also depicted in pictures taken by Major Charles Butt when he was in service for the Sultan of Oman armed forces between 1966 and 1978, and they can be seen and browsed in the online Middle East Center Archive of Oxford University. So this research started in Zakit, where in a relatively small area I was able to identify 390 monumental funerary structures. I should emphasize that no tombs in this area, either in Zakit or in the rest of Wadi Al Fain, have been excavated. So I have no direct dates, and all the chronological attribution I will refer to in my presentation, they are just tentative, and they derive from the interpretation of the surveyors based on the tomb's structural characteristics and their location in the landscape. So they are tentative, and they may and hopefully will change in some cases when some of these tombs will be excavated, possibly in the future, who knows. So these tombs were distributed across the entire area. the vast majority of them is clustered in front of the small present-day oasis of Zakit. And of course, the vast majority of them was comprised Hafid-type cairns, and they were mostly distributed on mountain ridges, while we also had roughly 30 potential Umanar tombs, or tombs roughly datable to possibly the second half of the 3rd millennium BC, on low terraces and in plain. And I also identified roughly 15 later bronze and different types of possible Iron Age structures on hill slopes and in plain. One of the main aspects that always struck me about Zakit is the prominence of their Hafid-type cairns. They literally dominate the valley, and they can be seen from pretty much everywhere. So viewshed and visibility are key aspects in this phase of the use of this site. This is another view of the Hafid-type cairns of Zakit in their pristine state. So Zakit was really important to start thinking about building techniques and use of different building materials in the realization of Hafid-type cairns in northern Oman. And it was immediately clear that Hafid-type cairns were built using locally available materials. And when I say local, I mean literally in the closest possible proximity to the tomb itself. I don't know if you can appreciate that in the tomb in the picture on the bottom right. It has two colors. So the upper half, roughly the half, is made of reddish stone, while the lower half is made of grayish stone. And the sequence of these colors is exactly the opposite of the sequence we have in the stratigraphy of the limestone underneath the tomb itself. So these stone slabs that can be detached very easily from this sedimentary limestone, and they can be worked really easily, and they're flat and thin, and they confer a certain degree of stability to these structures, were actually collected nearby the tombs themselves. In terms of entrance, those tombs for which I was able, to document an entrance present with a small entrance with a lintel, and I didn't find any sign of any sort of ogival section entrances that are documented somewhere else. As I said, there were also a certain number of potential Umanar tombs, and in addition to their location, they presented with these considerable dimensions. Here I'm reporting the picture of grave 130 with 16 meters of diameter and 1 meter and 20 centimeters of preserved height. The most remarkable finding in Zakit is certainly a small baconical jar with cylindrical neck and broken inverted rims. Unfortunately, the surface was abraded and no decoration was visible. This is a carinated small jar which was immediately identified by Circle Zoo as a Jemna Nasr, either Jemna Nasr or a dynastic small jar. You can now see this jar at the National Museum in Muscat. And this piece of pottery, of course, confirmed the use of tomb 109 in Zakit as a tomb belonging to the first half of the 3rd millennium BC, which would have been impossible to say by looking just at the structure, because as you can see, it was completely destroyed, and it's located on a plain actually really close to other Umanar tombs, potential Umanar tombs. So that's even more interesting. So the vessel contains some sediment, and I was able, with Juanjo Garcia Granero and Marco Madella, to run some archaeobotanical analysis, and we identified some pollen grains, some of which may refer to palm trees. And the phytolite assemblage was certainly dominated by palms, with a minor presence of dryland grasses. And of course, there's no way to determine whether the sediment was related to the interment, the original interment in the tomb, but that was the evidence we were able to extract from this. And of course, there are many parallels for this jar in northern Oman and other regions. But I would say from a morphological point of view, the closest parallel I can find is with a very similar piece that was recently found by Marco Ramazzotti in Al-Mawil, Grave 1, Area B. And as Corinne was saying yesterday, it would be really nice to be able to analyze both the vessel found in Sakit and this one to see whether the geochemical signal is local or not. So to give you a very crude summary of what I found beyond Sakit in Wadi al-Fin, I did an intensive pedestrian survey in all the areas where tomb structures were identified to cover a total area of roughly 270 square kilometers. The main goals were to create a census of funerary structures with a specific focus on the 3rd millennium BCE and to collect evidence of structural variability and at the same time to be able to give the ministry risk assessment for this area. The result of this was the identification of 682 monumental tombs, tentatively ranging between the Bronze Age and the entire Iron Age. Identified both structures and surface material just related to the structure themselves. I didn't conduct any systematic surface collection. And up to now, no non-funerary structure has been identified in the area, but of course they are there, and we need to look for them specifically, I would say. So the first window of interest to the south of Sakit is the one comprising Suq Qadim, Abd al-Hadid, and the north of the village of Shafa, where I identified about 80 structures, which, for their location, once again, and their dimension, suggests sort of a second half of the 3rd millennium or probably early 2nd millennium chronology. The diameter ranges between 10 and 14 meters, and many of them, and this is an interesting fact, many of them are present with an overlapping heap of pebbles. This lower and much smaller amount of pebbles, from which some dinoxic materials usually came out from the surface, and these materials were referable to the Iron Age. And I collected just a few examples across this area. We had spouted jars and decorated bowls, shells, a variety of beads in carnelian, stone, faience, and conus rings as well. So to the east of that window, there is Al-Aqal. Al-Aqal is also interesting because it presented with a much smaller concentration of structures, and these structures were slightly smaller than the ones presented before. I found these 16 potentially bronze or Iron Age structures. Their diameter ranges between 3 and 8 meters, and some of them, like the one we see at the bottom, are more easily attributed to human type because they present the usual squared and polished blocks. But nonetheless, Al-Aqal is particularly interesting to me because all tombs are built using locally available white and pink reddish stones, so they alternate these colors in their structure, and that's interesting. To the south of that, we have the area of Shafa, where we have more than 100 Hafid-type structures, mostly clustered in 3 main groups, appearing on mountain crops, and they vary greatly in this area depending on the local building material used. So in close proximity to these Hafid-type cairn clusters, there are tombs located on the plain. I identified 34 of them, and they're usually smaller than the ones I presented before. They have a diameter ranging between 3 and 6 meters, and they may seem in some cases, looking at the structure, Umanar tombs, but they may also be earlier structure with later use. Some of them presented on the surface some diagnostic materials which pointed to the second half of the third millennium or the beginning of the second millennium BCE. So to start summing up, Wadi al-Fin presented a great amount of structural variability, and most of it was depending on the locally available building materials that determine huge differences in the overall structure, appearance, and stability of these tombs. A recurrent finding in Wadi al-Fin was a considerable amount of hard stone hammers, similar to those that were used for copper mining or used in other contexts, such as Hilly, for generating more polished facades and to create a better arrangement of building blocks. And these are really recurrent in the vast majority of the tombs I observed. At the same time, many Hafi-type cairns presented a huge amount of flint and stone tools surrounding them. So it might be interesting in the future to look at different use of space around these tombs. They may or may not relate to their building. I also found considerable variety in the potentially Umanar or later Bronze Age tombs, also, once again, depending on the availability of different kinds of local materials. And just to give you a quick overview of the emerging spatio-temporal patterning in Wadi al-Fin, what it seems is that we have, let's say, the main concentration of the earliest tombs we have in the area, the Hafi-type cairns. They are mostly concentrated in the area of Zakit and to the south of Shafa, so the northernmost and southernmost part of it, although they are also present in smaller cluster in the outcrops in between. Potentially Umanar tombs, they are also clustered in closer proximity to these Hafi-type cairn clusters, while later Bronze and potentially Iron Age structures, they tend to sort of fill the gap and follow the let's say, the alluvial corridor more. So I'm going to skip this and get to some conclusions. So Wadi al-Fin present with some possible sign of continuity in the occupation from the early Bronze Age to the Iron Age, and that makes it an incredible laboratory where we can actually try to explore change over time in funerary practices within the same area. And also we see this sort of progressive filling of the alluvial corridor, which may suggest either an expansion of existing communities or a movement of these communities from certain areas to other areas. And that may be due to change in the preferred location. So the most important aspect of a tomb was, of course, prominence in the Hafid period, and it changed over time, possibly related also to change in settlement patterns. Once again, I found no settlement or no funerary structure related, of course, to the third and second millennium and first millennium BCE, but that doesn't mean they're not there. Once again, all the chronologies I mentioned are tentative, and although excavation is the main way with which we can tell more about a tomb, its use, and its possible chronology, I would also suggest that there are many ways in which we can try to quantify our uncertainty while we survey for these structures, and this is something I started attempting during my PhD, and I would like to resume as well. And I think it might be useful to create some priors that might help us to direct research intensity and to update our knowledge while we keep digging and investigating these structures. Thank you for your attention.
Perfect. Many thanks for this presentation. Any question?
Hi, thanks, Eugenio. Sorry, two questions, I suppose. I noticed in the tombs above Zucate, you had a lot of well-preserved entrances. And I wondered if, I remember Will Dedman did an analysis of entranceways in this area, and it was quite productive. It showed, so that's one question. The second question is, you mentioned continuity. That you've got early bronze and you've got Iron Age, but I mean, Wadi Suk and late bronze especially is a real, probably surprising. Did I switch off? You didn't have any evidence. It's possible I switched off.
No,
you've got
I
no
didn't.
late bronze. So I think it's a bit dangerous to assume that you've got continuity when there's. It'd be very surprising to have any sort of late bronze presence in this area. As up to now, we've hardly any evidence at all of the late bronze in this area. So it's slightly a dangerous assumption.
I agree. Probably I wasn't clear for the sake of brevity, but yeah, I think there's, as I said, all the chronology I mentioned are tentative. So it might well be that we might be able to find in the future some evidence related to Wadi Suk, late bronze, and late early Iron Age, for example, and some actual sign of continuity. This is just a hypothesis I have based on the fact that there is anachronic evidence. So there are gaps at present, but we may find out that there actually is the continuity. That's why I was saying that I think it's an interesting and challenging, but it's an interesting context that might give us the opportunity to look for actual continuity. And in terms of entrances, yes, I'm aware of Will work, and yes, I was just reporting the sort of more common entrance type, and I think that's also Kimberly mentioned that in her presentation. I think also for what I'm saying in Khalban, looking at tomb entrances might be interesting, and that was sort of a foundation on which I think increasing evidence can allow us to understand a bit more. Although there are so many factors that we have to keep into consideration, and as Kimberly was saying, there are first-order factors such as general orientation, the landscape, but there are also second-order indicators such as the presence of previous structures that we may have to factor in to model it on a larger scale. But yes, thanks a lot.
So thank you very much. And we skip to the next presentation. Next speaker, Sabrina Righetti. I apologize if I pronounce in Italian. She's an archaeologist specializing in the Middle East and late Bronze Age, especially in southern Eastern Arabia. She worked especially in the region of Adam, and she obtained a doctorate on a topic about the Wadi Suk period.
Okay. Good afternoon. First, I would like to thank the Ministry of Heritage and Tourism and the Sultan Qaboos University for the invitation. It is a real honor and pleasure to be here today. So I will talk about the transition from the late 3rd to the early 2nd millennium BC in southeastern Arabia, which has long been interpreted as a phase of decline or even a collapse following the Umana culture. Traditionally, the Wadi Suk period has been described as a so-called dark age, marked by depopulation, economic regression, and the breakdown of long-distance exchange networks. Today, I would like to revisit this interpretation. Rather than saying the Wadi Suk period as a collapse, I will argue that it represents a phase of transformation and adaptation. The Wadi Suk period was first identified in the early 70s. It's not working? Yes. During excavations at the necropolis of Wadi Suk by the Danish team led by Karen Friefeld. A few years later, in 1979, French excavations at Ely 8 revealed settlement layers belonging to this period under the direction of Serge Closius. It was first published in 1981, and in 2003, Christian Veld established a more refined chronology based on the analysis of the ceramic, soft stone, and metal assemblages. And today, the Wadi Souk is divided into two phases. The Wadi Souk 1, from 2000 to 1750 BC. The pottery you can see is from, all the material that I will present on this slide is from Shimal tomb. This one is from Shimal 96, and the soft stone vessel from Shimal 404. And the Wadi Souk 2 is from 1750 to 1600 BC. The pottery is from Shimal 99, and the soft stone vessel from Shimal 102. And it was followed by the Late Bronze Age. So I will not talk about Late Bronze Age today. During my PhD, I proposed to rename it Shimal period because it's mainly known from the Shimal settlement and the tombs in the Ras Al Rema area. So for a long time, the Wadi Souk period was interpreted as a phase of cultural and economic collapse. The interpretation relies largely on two observations: the disappearance of monumental domestic architecture and the reduced archaeological visibility of settlements. This period was defined by settlement abandonment, a sharp decline in long-distance exchange, particularly in copper production, a loss of technical skills, and a loss of continuity from the Umana period. However, the last 4 decades, and particularly during the last 15 years, new excavations have produced a substantial body of data that challenges this model. The collapse paradigm is less dominant than it was 20 years ago, but is still structurally present. In my view, the Wadi Souk period should be seen as a phase of reorganization and adaptation, rather than one of regression, implied by the notion of dark age. It is true that the large monumental settlements characteristic of the Umana period largely disappears from the archaeological record. However, this doesn't mean inhabited areas were abandoned. Occupation continues in the oasis and in coastal zones, but in different forms. What we observe is a shift towards smaller, more dispersed settlements, which are less visible archaeologically and therefore more difficult to identify. For a long time, our knowledge of Wadi Souk domestic architecture relied mainly on surveys and test trenches. Extensive excavations remain rare, and the evidence is fragmentary. Nevertheless, occupation has been identified at several sites, such as Tel Abrak, that you can see on the picture, Iliate, Bat, or Ras Al Jins 1. Wadi Souk 1 levels are mainly characterized by earth and postholes, indicating installation built with perishable materials. At some sites, such as Tawi Said or Tel Abrak, mud brick platforms have also been documented. In addition, new occupation sites have been identified at Tawi Said and Rorfakan, for example. In these sites, in Rorfakan, you can see on the bottom left corner, they have excavated houses built in stone. Recent excavations in the Liwa region revealed a small Wadi Souk settlement with stone-built houses. Wadi Souk pottery and even a sherd from Dilmun suggesting continued integration into exchange networks. At Wadi Fiz, a late Wadi Souk site, the site appears to have functioned as a storage site with terrace walls and large storage areas. The authors suggest a use by the communities that may have been absent a part of the year. Together, these data support the idea of more dispersed and possibly partially more mobile communities, but not an abandonment of the southern part of the peninsula. These settlement changes suggest a reorganization of settlement system rather than demographic collapse. Reduced architectural investment may reflect increased mobility, more flexible occupation patterns, or shorter-term settlements. In this perspective, reduced archaeological visibility is not a sign of cultural regression, but the material expression of new adaptive strategies. Different types of sites reflect a variety of settlement patterns. ranging from probably sedentary to semi-sedentary occupations located in coastal zones, oasis environments, or in areas linked to the exploitation of specific resources, such as shell, copper, or trade routes. Funerary practices provide particularly valuable insights into this transformation. During the Umana period, funerary architecture is highly standardized, with monumental collective tombs that express the shared social framework. You can see an Umana tomb on the left part of the slide. In contrast, the Wadi Souk period is marked by strong diversification. New types of tombs appear, and collective and individual burial practices coexist. You can see on in the middle of the screen, it was all the type of collective and individual tombs that I found and documented in my PhD thesis. We also observe a regional contrast. In the north of the peninsula, collective tombs dominate. So you can see on the map, just on the bottom right. Whereas in the south, based on current knowledge, only individual tombs are present. And I insist on based on current knowledge. Establishing a precise chronology is difficult because these tombs were often used over long periods and were frequently disturbed. For my PhD, I established a relative chronology based on the oldest artifacts found in the tomb and proposed the typology based on the main architectural characteristic of the tombs. So it was divided into subterranean, above ground, monocellular and pluricellular tombs to try to understand if there was a pattern. I will now not talk about collective tombs for 15 minutes. And recent work by Kenneth, Ken, Hilton, and Wicks has documented more than 2,100 tombs across 80 sites, and they based the study on the Veld's chronology of architecture evolution, and thinking that they derived from the Umana type. So you can see on the right side. And they distinguish between surface-built collective tombs and subterranean ones. I will not talk much longer about collective tombs, and because also I think that the great number of the funerary diversity and the large number of tomb types are likely to increase further as the new research progresses. And in my opinion, they are the image of group preferences more than cultural differences. I will focus here on individual tombs, which are less studied as a whole. At the time of my PhD, individual tombs represent 66% of the funerary architecture I analyzed. Most of them are subterranean and share the typical Wadi Souk architectural feature of double-faced walls. Human remains were often poorly preserved, and 44% of the graves contain no human remains at all, despite being structurally intact. This absence cannot be explained totally by soil conditions or climate, nor can it be explained by looting. 5% of the graves, lacking human remains, were also devoid of grave goods, whereas 90% of the graves without human remains did contain grave goods. I suggested that these graves were temporary burials used when individuals died far from their family cemetery. This interpretation finds parallels in ethnographic contexts, such as among the Imerina of Madagascar. In the northern region, individual tombs are also present, although they do not form a distinct architectural type. They may represent similar temporary burials, possibly linked to symbolic prohibitions. This funerary diversity shows strong regional variability. Rather than indicating a loss of social norms, it points to a redefinition of social identities and group affiliations. Funerary organization, especially for collective graves, may reflect family-based or tribal structures. Overall, this diversity suggests a fragmentation of social reference frameworks and a renegotiation of group and individual identities, new relationships between people, territory, and ancestry. These developments took place within a broader context of climatic instability at the end of the 3rd millennium BC, associated with the well-documented 4200 BC event. This likely placed increasing pressure on oasis-based agricultural systems. Water availability seems to have been a key factor, conditioning where communities could settle. Areas such as the Sir and Jiri plains with high water table and fertile soils would have been particularly favorable, although most settlement sites remain to be excavated extensively. Exchange networks were also reoriented, but not discontinued. Bitumen points to contact with Iranian sources, and exported objects are documented in surrounding areas. You can see on the map a few of them in Faleka Island, in Dahan, and in the coastal sites of Iran. Whereas copper trade with Mesopotamia was central during the Umayyad period, by the early 2nd millennium BC, Dilmud had become the main intermediary. This may help explain denser occupation along the northern Dilmun-facing coast, as suggested by Derek Kennett in 2025. Settlement and funerary distributions reflect a complex social landscape. Populations appear more concentrated in northern areas with better water access, but characteristic Wadi Souk material is found through the peninsula. There is also continuity with the Umayyad period in pottery traditions, with the decorative motifs, and in settlement locations, and also in funerary practice, as you can see on the left side. In the top, you have the tomb A at Ilinos, and which is Umayyad, and in the bottom, you have the Karnal tomb, which is Wadi Souk. The supposed loss of technical knowledge must also be reconsidered. Recent work at Karnal shows, as Lloyd Weeks points out, that craftsmen had a sophisticated understanding of materials and techniques. Rather than a rupture, societies responded to environmental and social constraints through increased mobility, economic diversification, and regionalized interaction networks. These constraints acted as a structuring conditions rather than direct cause of change. In conclusion, reassessing the Wadi Souk period allows us to move beyond decline-based narratives that have long shaped our understanding of the early 2nd millennium BC in southeastern Arabia. Far from being a dark age, it was a complex, dynamic phase characterized by social reorganization, adaptive strategies, regional diversity. The restriction of collective tombs to the north raises questions. Were they never built elsewhere? Have they simply not yet been identified, not well dated, or even not published yet? Other regions show hydrological conditions compatible with settlements and these funerary developments, suggesting a promising avenue for future research, particularly in the Batina, in mountain oases, and in central Oman, maybe around Bisya or Bat. Large-scale excavation of settlement sites will be essential to better understand occupation patterns. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this presentation. Any question? So I just make a comment. I agree with you that considering Wadi Souk period as a collapse period is not correct. You mentioned the continuity in pottery style and manufacturing. Can you add some detail?
It's a study by Michel de Vries. He published an article I will tell you, he worked on that very well, so it's his work. It's Michel de Vries in 2016. He published.
What do you think?
Oh, I feel it's, I completely agree. I feel there is a continuity in pottery, and not only in pottery, but in pottery, yeah. It's not a clear discontinuity. It's not a collapse. They don't stop doing some patterns and then just change all the patterns. And for the animal motifs, we can see a clear continuity with
I agree completely, because you know that we have the case study of Koutoum that is perfectly in continuity, and not only for the occupation, but especially for the pottery production. Thank you. So we profit to take time, and I will call the next speaker, Michele Degli Esposti, that will present with Andrea Zerboni. I just close this. Fallo tu che fai prima.
Quindi?
Condividi lo schermo. Sopra.
Okay. Hi, everyone. I will keep it short as we are running a bit late. And actually, I just wanted to basically present you with some peculiar structures that we found while working in the surrounding of Hussein Salute, in the wider area of what is now the Salute and Bizia archaeological sites park. So the result of this, what I will be presenting today, is just a small part of the multi-scope and long-lasting mission of the Italian archaeological mission in the area, first led by the University of Pisa, and since a few years by the University of Milan. Some of these results have already been published, and being such a wide scope, it notably included both residential sites and funerary sites. So very quickly, we have prominent settlement sites spanning from the early Bronze Age, so with a, let's say, tower or circular monument, how you want to call it, at ST1, that has been mentioned also during other presentation during this conference, and obviously the prominent Iron Age site of Salute, which comprise what has been named Hussein Salute, much well known than the surrounding settlement, which we termed Cariat Salute, which anyhow, as you can see, has quite its importance. Alongside these funerary remains, we investigated a series of funerary structures, small clusters, small necropolis, some spanning much later, well, actually some being dated much later than these main sites, among which this late Islamic necropolis, which still has to be fully published, I know. We will work on that. And recently, actually, you found this on the volume of the JUS that has been distributed. Also, we've completed the excavation of this peculiar, well, rather peculiar structure that we thought could be great, and we finally had the proof. Just a quick mention here, I label them B or G. Instead, in the paper, they are BG, because there will be other BG that we will be working on and hopefully report you about, not too late in time. By the way, apart from this couple of later necropolis, all the hills facing the site and bordering the Salute Plain from the northeast are, as is quite usual and not exceptional in Oman, dotted by dozens, probably hundreds of graves. Here is just a small portion of it, of those hills, a digital model elaborated by Stefano Bizzarri. The French mission in Central Oman actually, a few years ago, carried out a much more extensive survey, so surely they will, at one point, show us a much larger number of these structures. With the Italian mission, we targeted, as I said, a few ones of these graves, and we documented large variability and quite a wide chronology. So we had some early Bronze Age and Middle Bronze Age graves on the top of what is called by the locals Jebel Salut. This has been this has been published in this old booklet, and what you see now is what you see in this slide is a cluster of Middle Bronze Age, which is Wadi Souk graves, which are interesting because already they show quite a variability. And the one that is marked as gray one is actually the reused part of an earlier Bronze Age grave. These were just on top of, along the crest of the hill. We then targeted a few other samples. Well, let's say we sampled some of the other graves along the slopes and closer to the plain. And this I will just go through quickly to show you that, as has been already illustrated, there is a great variability in shapes, in preservation, in goods, of which I will not, about which I will not talk today. So this is another cluster very close to what has become, where it has been constructed the visitor center in the park. A farther away cluster again, you see different types of graves, Bronze Age and Wadi Souk graves. But what I want, the evidence, the first place where we found the evidence which I would like to point your attention to is another cluster which is called Jebel Salut 4. And you see that this digital surface model shows you quite a number of graves, much more than you would be able to see with the naked eye. We targeted, let's say, a slice of this area for excavation. Again, you see there is not, not one grave equal to the other. Of this, we also carried out a conservative reconstruction, to say so, which is also enables the visitors of the park to better understand the original structure of these monuments, because working in that context, we always have in mind the goal of making the remains understandable by the public, because it's not always very easy. These graves have been published on an older number of the JOS, but I would like to point attention now to two of these structures which have been labeled as graves, but they might not be graves, and that is why I mentioned funeral-related structure in the title. So there are G5 and G7. G5 actually is a small structure which we found sealed, which is maybe the only occurrence of a sealed second millennium grave. I don't know. Maybe you can correct me. And so small round structure, not very deep, as the other one, and sorry, this is the other one. Both are circular structure, not very deep, and as you saw from as you see from the small plan into the bottom left, they are somehow connected to a larger subterranean chamber grave. It likely had an upper structure, and like the graves, they are datable to the Wadi Souk period. For the graves, this is quite evident. For the main graves of this transect I show you, it's quite evident by the typical pottery, typical soft stone, and as always, as often happens, there is evidence for a use with this clear iron H3 cup. Indeed, it can also come from, let's say, a frequentation, people wandering around the area, because we had found, even before the excavation of this grave, quite a large number of even complete Iron Age shapes, profiles on top of decayed graves of earlier times. I guess that by now this seems not exceptional to anyone any longer. Coming back to the two small structures, what was interesting, or I think can be interesting, is the fact that they both reflect almost identical repertoire assemblage of grave goods. And there is no trace of bones in either of them. Also in the main graves, there were known to very little and very badly preserved bones. Why this is open to debate. One can simply dismiss it with acid soil decomposition, complete decomposition of the bones, but this we cannot prove. By the way, as you see these two very similar assemblages with typical Wadi Souk small caps, and associated with one so-called cosmetic shell, so a shell bearing a mineral powder, and one fig shell, or also so-called feeding shell. As we moved along and excavated another cluster of graves, which I quickly showed before, we found another similar structure, again abutting the main grave, so built later. And although this was much more impacted by later events, we were able to collect at least part of the original grave goods, which, interestingly enough, again consist of one Wadi Souk cup and a feeding shell. In the same area, which we labeled JS6, okay, yeah, we targeted two more graves. Again, in these last two cases, the main grave, okay. In these last two cases, we could not complete the excavation of the main grave, which we hope to go back in the future. But we investigated the additional structure just because we were struck by the similarities and the recurrence of these structures. And again, here, in a very much poorly preserved annex, we found, again, a typical Wadi Souk beaker. Finally, not far from this grave, another case of this association, main grave with auxiliary structure, was discovered. Here, apparently, there is no preserved grave good. And again, in all these additional three examples, no trace of bones. I mean, we clearly see everything, but there was not even the smallest bit. What actually struck us is the presence of these recurring traits for this auxiliary structure. So you've seen the small circular or semicircular structure, which is always a later addition to a let's say, more common grave, the presence of typical black painted beakers, and the association, well, now clearly we are interpolating from the complete assemblages to the incomplete ones, the presence of a so-called cosmetic shell and of a so-called feeding shell. By the way, we also published a first short paper about the analysis of some of the cosmetic shells coming from the area of Salute in general, and we have in review a larger work on many more sites from the Emirates and from Oman. So, what interpretation do we want to give to these structures? And actually, this is an open question. One could think about grave depositions, mainly driven by the presence of what is being referred to as feeding shell. I know that Eugenio doesn't completely agree with this. And in that case, one could justify the complete disappearance of the bones by the fact that infant bones are clearly less resistant. Could they be small cenotaphs, which might also be connected to one of the hypotheses that Sabrina was doing before? Or are they cultic or ceremonial, or you want to call it, features connected to a later frequentation of the area, maybe any kind of occasion or ceremony that you can imagine connected to the cult of the ancestor or the remembering of the ancestor, communal remembering of the ancestors. Clearly, there are many other possibilities. And actually, leaving aside what final interpretation we can prefer, the other point is, well, admittedly, at a very quick survey, I didn't locate other places where this specific type of addition has been documented. At the same time, they are not associated with all the graves that we have. So could this be a very specific local tradition, local use, if not tradition, maybe also not of the whole community, but of part of the community living in the area in the second millennium? I don't know, but this might be an example of a way to trace really specific customs among within a tradition which seems quite homogeneous, despite the great variability in tomb shapes that we have seen. Because tomb shapes, this variability in tomb shape is not reflected, for example, in the same degree of variability of the pottery or even of the soft stone vessel. So actually this was just the little point that we wanted to raise, and if any of you have suggestions or parallels to point to us, is very welcome. And with this, I thank you.